Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at Home Stage. For any newcomers, my name's Ellie and I'm the host of Garden Club. I'll give you a very brief introduction. This evening we welcome Charles Williams, who's the owner and operator of Caerhays Gardens and Estate, for an hour. Hello, Charles.
Good evening.
Charles has quite a few accolades to his name, not least being proud recipient of the coveted RHS Victoria Medal of Honour. So I shall now hand you over to Charles to tell you all about his National Magnolia collection.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm just going to go through a few odd facts about magnolias, then we'll have a look at a few slides, and then we'll have a look at a few magnolias in situ. No group of trees and shrubs is more favourably known or more highly appreciated in gardens than magnolias. And no group produces larger or more abundant blossoms, stated the great plant explorer Ernest Wilson about 120 years ago. That's a view to which I fully subscribe, and I rather hope that by the end of this talk, you might be of the same view as well. I just wanted to set the scene a little bit about the history of magnolias. Magnolia was named by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus in 1737 in honor of the French botanist Pierre Magnol, who lived between 1638 and 1715. The plant which Magnol had described is what we now know to be Magnolia virginiana, an evergreen species from America, which despite its name was already growing in Europe by the mid-18th century. The earliest Western record of magnolias in cultivation is found in Aztec history at the time of Montezuma. Astonishing fact, really, where there are illustrations of what we now know to be the very rare Magnolia dilbata, which comes from Mexico and we can just about grow in Cornwall. This plant now survives in only a very few places in the wild, and although climate change is largely to blame, the natives cut the flowers for festivals, and that prevents the plants from seeding. Was found originally by a Spanish explorer called Hernandez, who was commissioned by Philip II of Spain and whose work was published in 1651. Magnolias are, however, one of the most primitive plants in evolutionary history, and fossil records show that magnolias once existed in Europe, North America, and Asia over 100 million years ago. Today, they're indigenous only in southern China and in the south of the United States. There are about 80 to 100 species of magnolia which can be grown in temperate climates, and quite a few more that might grow only in the tropics. The genus Magnolia is the largest within the group of Magnoliaceae, but there are other linked genera such as Rhododendron or the tulip tree, which has magnolia-type flowers, and Mycelias, of which there are probably 40, maybe 60 species, and then Mangletias, of which there are about the same number of species. Now, Chinese taxonomists and botanists have had a field day and now decided that there's no such thing as a Mycelia or a Mangletia, and they're all properly called magnolias. This has led to quite a bit of confusion because there were Mycelias which were called the same thing as magnolias, so a right bugger's muddle has then been created between what is what. But to answer the question, there are probably about 200 species of magnolia which can be grown if you use the Chinese interpretation. Even more astonishingly, the closest genetic relative of the magnolia in evolutionary terms is Ranunculaceae, or the buttercup. Some of the earliest references to magnolia in literature refer to their purported medicinal properties. And anyone who's ever smelt the peculiar smell of magnolia sap, and what an alluring smell it is too, will see that this was likely to appeal to those who are involved in medicine. The flower buds of Magnolia salicifolia are used in Asia to treat headaches and allergies. More recently, the tonics from the bark of Magnolia officinalis have been used to lessen tremor in sufferers with Parkinson's disease. Who knows what may yet be discovered? In the wild, magnolias, and by in the wild I mean in China, Asiatic magnolias in China. In the wild, magnolias grow 7,000 feet from sea level on the edges of mountains in forest scrubland. And because the magnolia is such a primitive plant, originally they were pollinated by wingless beetles, which climbed up the tree, found a flower, went to the next flower, and on things went. Now, magnolia flowers are as large and beautiful as they are to attract beetles, and they don't have any nectar as such, but they do have huge amounts of pollen, which is what beetles like. Now, in modern day times, obviously we do have winged insects, and so pollination can take place from tree to tree in a way that it couldn't take place in evolutionary times because beetles couldn't travel very far on the ground. And this has led to one of the most unusual paradoxes. When the great plant hunters Wilson and Forrest were making expeditions to China at the turn of the last century, they reported Chinese native people cutting down white magnolias and burning them as firewood, but thinking the pink magnolias were absolutely wonderful. Now, once we bring back magnolias into our climate, we soon discover that we do have winged insects. We also discover that when we take seed from plants growing in the gardens over in the UK, pink is the dominant gene, and all the seedlings we take turn out to be pink, even if they come from plants which had white flowers. So this is something that is a straight paradox between Chinese view on what is a good magnolia and our view on what is a good magnolia. And today we would value pure whites in the UK probably more than pinks, whether we'll rather more choice. The Chinese think the opposite. And it's all down really to beetles in the earliest times. Now let's just think about what is a national collection of magnolias and what's the point of it and why we got one. And the first point to make is that there are 4 national collections of magnolias in the UK, and so there should be. And there's a wonderful collection at Savile Gardens in Windsor, and there's a wonderful collection at Bodnant, and the 4th natural collection has changed, the ownership has changed hands, so I'm not sure how that's going. And the point of a national collection is so that you establish in one place as many species and varieties, whether they be hybrids or cultivars of magnolias as possible, to enable the public to see them in one place and all together. More importantly, we are talking about the survival of genetic material which often originated in the wild. And one has to remember that many of these magnolia species which we're about to see are endangered in the wild. And therefore, what Wilson and Forrest brought back to this country between 1902 and 1932, some of those plants, we very much need those plants here. And one day, maybe we'll be able to grow plants and send them back to China, if we're still speaking to them by then, that is. And maybe when the plants threaten to die out, we can import and send them progeny from ours and keep the species going. So there's a scientific aspect to a national collection, which is really quite important. Beyond that, what is it that makes a national collection? And in crude terms, you were supposed to have 75% of the species and cultivars listed in the Hilliers manual. Well, that's fairly crude. In reality today, the National Collection Scheme, which covers many genuses and many species of plants, is run by Plant Heritage. They used to be called the NCCPG. And Plant Heritage have strict rules for collection qualifying. It has to be properly labeled, it has to be properly recorded, and it has to be available to other people for scientific use. And all those things are good things. So that's really what a national collection is. And I think that's possibly enough wittering for the moment. So let's go and look at a few pictures of magnolias, and let's look at a few themes, if we may. So we're going to first start by looking at magnolia species. And the tallest growing, largest, and possibly best known of those magnolia species is Magnolia campbelli. Now, Magnolia campbelli was a plant which was first discovered in about 1850, and it first appeared in Ireland in about 1870, whereas the plant of Caerhays arrived here in 1913. And today it's about 100, 120 feet tall, and you're looking at it in all its glory. Magnolia campbelli is the signature theme of the Great Gardens of Cornwall. When 6 gardens have got 50 flowers on their Magnolia campbelli, we declare that spring has sprung, and we hope that people will rush down to Cornwall, at least in another year, and come and have a look at these wonderful, huge trees. Magnolia campbelli is very early flowering, and spring has sprung in Cornwall as early as the first week of February. This week it was more like the last week of February, as the cold weather delayed things, and magnolias do know when there's cold weather coming. So Magnolia campbelli is a huge and impressive plant, and one which comes in many different shapes and forms. It's quite different in context. What I'm going to try and explain to you is if you just flip back to Magnolia campbelli for a second, you see how the center of the flower is pointed. And that is the way in which, when you look at a magnolia, you can tell if it's campbelli because it's pointed. And then if we move on to Magnolia sargentiana robusta, which is on the next slide, you'll see a completely different flower habit. Instead of the flowers standing proud, the flowers are really quite floppy on the plant, and they're a slightly darker color, but the petals flop down. And then if we move on to the third and equally well-known Chinese species, this is Magnolia mollicumata. Don't worry about that, it's supposedly a form of campbelli. Mollicumata has its distinct characteristic is that the center of the flower opens like a light bulb. When it's fully open, it opens flat, but unlike campbelli, which has a point, and sargentiana robusta, which goes flop like that, mollicumata has a central sort of light bulb effect, which is quite unique to that particular species. And then we move on to the fourth of our Chinese species. This is Magnolia dorsoniana, which is the last of the tree magnolias from China to flower in any one season. It was named after Jackson Dawson, who was superintendent of the Arnold Arboretum in Massachusetts, and it only reached Europe in 1919. What you have to remember is that nobody in Western Europe had seen any tree that could flower with this many flowers and grow to this sort of height until after the First World War. And it was only in 1918 that at an RHS show in Vincent Square, Caerhays exhibited tree magnolias, and people were absolutely gobsmacked. They couldn't believe that a tree could flower like that. They'd known that Magnolia campbelli was around, but the problem with Magnolia campbelli is it can take 20 to 30 years to start flowering as a seedling. So it took a while to catch up, whereas the other species flowered away much more quickly. So the net result was that in the 1930s and 1940s, people were desperate to acquire seedlings of these tree magnolias, and Hilliers purchased hundreds, if not thousands, of seedlings each year from Caerhays, And that was the basis of how these tree magnolias got distributed into our UK gardens. But let's move on to another species, which is very different again. Magnolia springeri, we now know is a really diverse species in the wild, and can be pink, it can be white, and it can come in quite a few shades of color. But it grows in the forests of Sichuan at quite a low level for a magnolia, between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. It was named in honor of a German nurseryman who lived in Italy called Carl Sprenger, and it was introduced by E.H. Wilson in 1913. Now, there were only 4 seedlings to start with, and the one that came to Caerhays has this unique shape and unique color and unique petal formation, and it's forever after been known as Springeri diva. And you will see it on the front cover of Jim Gardner's book, excellent book on magnolias. The old plant died of old age about 15 years ago, but not before it had been propagated and grafted, and the young plants now abound in the garden here. But I wouldn't want you to think that all Magnolia springeris look like diva, because they don't, but I think diva probably is still the finest form of that particular species. And then we come on to the possibly the most exotically colored species, and one where there is considerable doubt as to whether or not it's a species in its own right, and that is Magnolia Campbelli var molicumata, subspecies Lanarth. Now, this was found in China in the 1930s. It's a very small bush, although that photograph doesn't show it terribly well, and it has a color. It depends how you try to put colors into words, but it's a very dark reddish purple, and it's a fantastic color, a color that's been used in Magnolia crossbreeding. But in China, it came from an area some 3,000 miles from any other Magnolia species. And because it was only discovered in the 1930s, only a very few seeds came back to the UK. The reason it's called subspecies Lanarth is because the first plants were grown at Lanarth in Cornwall, which is down on the Lizard Peninsula, and there they still live very happily today, only at about 15 or 20 feet, but with this exceptionally early flowering, wonderful color. And in evolutionary terms, it is probable that during the Ice Age, somehow this magnolia got moved away from its compatriots and by a glacial movement. And today, nobody's quite certain whether it should be a species in its own right, or whether it's something really quite a part of another subgenus. Personally, I think it's a species in its own right, but I don't use DNA analysis to work these things out. I merely look at what I see. The final species, or no, not quite the final, yes, it is the final one, is Magnolia sargentiana. And you can see that this magnolia has a very different flower shape again. And the reason the pictures look a bit torrid and dull is that our 1913 plant has only flowered once in my lifetime and never flowered at all in my father's lifetime. So the pictures we grabbed were from about 12 years ago. We've no idea why a perfectly healthy plant hasn't flowered at all. But when it did flower, the petals are very droopy, they're quite narrow, and they're totally unlike Sargentiana robusta. We've propagated the plant furiously, and we hope that other people will have more luck in getting it to flower than we have. But it's the final one of the Chinese species which were unknown in Western Europe until, about 1910, or seen in flower after the First World War. Today, we see these plants growing all around, but those are the key species that are relevant to today's hybridization and today's gardeners. So we move swiftly on just to glance at another few Magnolia species. And I have to say that I'm just scratching at the surface of a very large subject. And in a normal lecture, I would simply have as many plants as possible sitting in front of me, but sadly that's not possible in this format. So if we look at some evergreen species, here is one that's pretty well unknown because it's quite tender, and although it will grow into a 40-foot tree in Cornwall, it probably wouldn't grow anywhere other than the west coast of Scotland or somewhere which was particularly mild by the sea. And this is Magnolia nitida, which is Chinese, and it has the most gorgeous yellowish flowers with a scent which, if it could be bottled, we too would be Yves Saint Laurent of the future, because it's the most gorgeous smell you would ever wish to see. And you can also see, just glowing in the middle of the picture, you can see the wonderful reddish new growth that this plant has. It doesn't flower every year. When it does, it sets lots and lots of seed. And we probably recommend that most people grow it in the conservatory because it's not that hardy. Anyway, moving on to something which many more of you will know, which is the great evergreen Chinese magnolia, which is Magnolia Delaveyi. And this Caerhays is an enormous tree, which is completely evergreen. It's not as well known as the American evergreen, which we'll come on to. It flowers from midsummer through until the first frost. Not all the flowers come out at once by any means, and the scent of the flowers is usually only smelt in the evening because it's pollinated by moths and insects that operate at night. There are forms which have red bits on the petals, but the basic Magnolia Delaveyi is cream fading to white. It's a tree that you can cut down as much as you like. It doesn't mind. And although you're looking at the tree there in the picture, only this year did we uplift all the lower branches so people could walk underneath it more easily. And if we move on to the Great American Magnolia, evergreen Magnolia, that's Magnolia grandiflora. Now, grandiflora is much easier to propagate than Delaveyi. It's much better known in British gardens, and very commonly it's grown up against a wall. And the reason for that is that its huge leaves weigh such a lot that if you grow it out in the open, you tend to get branches splitting off in high winds. And up against the wall, it likes the heat and it flowers rather more profusely. There are no less than 200 different varieties of Magnolia grandiflora, but basically they're creamy white. The second reason for growing them up against a wall, particularly a wall of your house, is that, again, they're pollinated by insects and moths which operate at night. So the best scent you get in the evenings, sitting with your gin and tonic, and you can smell a lovely Magnolia grandiflora as well as a lovely gin and tonic at the same time. So we move on now to just a few other deciduous Magnolia species. And I'm just going to whip through these really quite quickly. This is Magnolia Seboldii, subspecies sinensis, but Seboldii is very similar. And it holds its flowers at right angles to the stem. So they don't actually hang down, they hang sideways. And you can see that the anthers have that lovely sort of pinkish color, which is offset so nicely against the flower. And this species flowers May, June time and flowers away on sometimes into July. And the seeds are huge pink. And if you can get them before the squirrels do, they're very easy to propagate. An old favorite and possibly certainly the best known Magnolia species in the UK is Magnolia stellata. Japan was opened up to foreign trade approximately 100 years before the plant explorers got into China. So Magnolia stellata has been with us for at least 200 years. And the plant which you're looking at there at Caerhays was planted in 1897 up against a wall, although you can't really see the wall properly in that picture, but it's still going strong. Sometimes it flowers in February, sometimes it waits until early April. It is hugely floriferous, and it's not very big. After 120 years, our plant is only about 15 foot tall with a similar width. So here's a magnolia for a small garden, if ever there was one. And there are lots of different forms of stellata, but the basic Japanese species is small growing and very easy to grow. Magnolia cylindrica is a much less well-known species, and again, the original plant collections from China were dwarf, and the flowers were dwarf growing, and the flowers were pure white with this gorgeous purple flash along the bottom. And this is an introduction from Korea, which came from the Cholipo arboretum, which is particularly fine and only came into the country about 20 years ago. And then we come on to another summer flowering species from Sikkim and Bhutan. And this is Magnolia globosa. And this really does flower, almost the last species of deciduous magnolia to flower, normally in July, sometimes in August. And it has this gorgeous orange indumentum on the buds and on the new leaf coverings, which you can't see terribly well there. But if you look up down the stem, you see that beautiful orange. And the final species, just to fill you in on, is Magnolia wilsoni. This one flowers just as the leaves are coming, so probably May, June time. And here the flowers do hang down. So it's a species you want to grow on a bank so you can walk under it and look up at it. And unlike Sibaldii, you see that it has much darker anthers. And the two species aren't that different, but in habit and in growth habit, wilsoni is a sprawling multi-stem plant, and Sibaldii is more upright. So by now you're thinking, my God, how many slides has he got, and how many magnolia varieties are there? I mean, I've told you how many exist. The named cultivars of magnolia, according to the Magnolia Society International, which is based in Massachusetts, it records 1,603 different varieties. And there's a wonderful book which came out last year by Otto Eisenhut, who is a great Swiss magnolia breeder, and his father was before him. And in his book, he has pictures of just over 1,000 different magnolia varieties. So that gives you a quantum. But many of those new varieties have been bred in the last 20 years, and the numbers of magnolias which we need to have in the national collection has grown exponentially, and we've had to take in another 40 acres of field and woodland to house the ever-growing number of magnolias. But I do promise you that we won't be going through the whole lot, even if we could, which actually in my garden diary, which I write every day, you probably could search out at least 600 or 700 of them. Anyway, moving swiftly on, we come to Magnolia Caerhays Surprise, which is possibly the best known of the Caerhays bred hybrids. And it has a very peculiar story. It's a cross between Magnolia mollicumata, which would normally flower in early March, and Magnolia liliflora nigra, which would normally flower in May or possibly even into June. And in the 1960s, the head gardener here, Philip Dragana, very cleverly found two flowers which were out at the same time and cross-pollinated them. And what he produced was something which had enormous hybrid vigor. And when I say that, Magnolia liliflora is a small shrub, grows to 4 or 5 feet, and Mollicumata is a big tree. So the hybrid vigor manifests itself in the fact that this magnolia grows about half the height, so 20 feet after 20 years. And the flowers have that gorgeous red-black color when they're in bud that you get in Liliflora nigra, and when they open, they change color a bit and go lighter pink. This was registered in the 1970s, and it won an RHS Award of Merit and a Corey Cup for the best new plant introduction in the year. We tried it in tissue culture in the nursery, but found that actually it was easier to grow ourselves from cuttings because tissue culture and magnolias don't work terribly well. Anyway, it's a very good plant for a small garden. It flowers even in a pot at a very young age when grafted, and there are many, many of these plants dotted all around the country, singing the praises of Caerhays Surprise. And then we come on to a rather earlier, one of the first Caerhays hybrids, and this is Caerhays Bell, which is a cross between Sargentiana robusta and Mollicumata. And despite its name, it was actually named after a lady called Belle Blanford, who in her 90s was the first person to see this tree you see flowering, and my father called it after her. It's one of the most floriferous trees you could ever wish to see, and when it's full out with a blue sky behind it, there's really nothing to touch it. We just got another couple of quick ones, and this is Magnolia F.J. Williams, which is a cross between Sprengeri diva and Magnolia Lanarth, and it has this gorgeous red, if that's the right way to describe it, red bud. When you register a magnolia, you're supposed to use the RHS color chart to decide how you record the colors. The RHS color chart costs 460 quid, and it's like going to one of those paint shops and being so overwhelmed with colors that you really don't know where to begin. The problem is that magnolias change color, and as you can see in these two pictures, the color of the bud and the color of the flower when it's been out for a fortnight are two very different things. And so when you're registering it, which color are you supposed to put down? And there are so many colors that frankly one gives up. And at the end of the day, how do you find a name to describe those colors? Magnolia was quite a famous color in wallpaper terms, but actually today magnolia can mean such a variety of colors, as we'll see, that magnolia wallpaper is a bit of a nonsense, and magnolias are no longer all pink. Anyway, moving on, we come to Magnolia J.C. Williams, which was a similar cross, but made in the 1970s, and it's flowers much later in the year than F.J. Williams, and is a really much darker color, almost black in bud. And the plant growing in the picture is actually growing in Anthony Gardens up by Tor Point in the teeth of the wind, and the flowers, I'm afraid, look as though they've been blown open a bit prematurely. But anyway, it's a different color, and it's a late flowering one at that, so that's exciting. And the final one, and I'm now teasing you a little bit, is Magnolia Tropicana. And this is a cross between Magnolia Sprengeri diva, which we saw earlier, and a yellow magnolia, and we'll come on to talk about them a bit more in a minute. I mean, normally if you cross pink and yellow, you get a dirty brown in genetic terms, and for some reason, when we did this cross between a Acuminata fertile myrtle and Sprengeri diva, we got the best of both worlds, and we got an odd combination of yellow and pink and green in bud, and some people might say they find that pretty disgusting. I think it's really quite unusual and different in magnolia terms, and that was bred in the last 10 years here, and is now registered with the International Magnolia Society, and has proved quite popular. How did we give it a name? We ran a competition amongst garden visitors, and we didn't think that technicolored yawn was probably an appropriate description for it. Settled on Tropicana, which the lady who thought up the name swore was a cocktail she'd had in somewhere in the Caribbean quite recently. So there we go. And turning back to more conventional magnolias, this is Magnolia Philip Tregunna. Philip was head gardener here at Caerhays from 1955 until 1996. And if you recognize that a magnolia might take 15 to 20 years to flower as a seedling, not as a grafted plant, as you might buy in a garden center, but as a seedling, then you realize that you don't breed many magnolias in your lifetime. And quite often the seedlings that you waited 15 to 20 years for turn out to be absolute rubbish, and the chainsaw comes out, and there we go. You can't always tell when you get the first one or two flowers, because first year a magnolia flowers, it isn't necessarily flowering completely true. You should give it 2 or 3 years, but often you haven't produced something new and unique. But Philip Tregunna is shaped like a water lily, and this year it's been actually the best magnolia in the garden, absolutely perfect for about 3 weeks. And that photograph was taken a long time ago. It's double that size now and has thousands and thousands of flowers. And then one named after my mother, which is again about double the size it was in the photograph. It's a light pink, similar breeding to Caerhays Bell, but it's one of those magnolias that when you look up underneath it, you think, my goodness, how can a tree ever really produce that number of flowers and be that spectacular? And then we got Sprengerii diva Burncoose, which is a Burncoose Nurseries bred form, which grows by the house of Burncoose and was crossed in 1964. And it has a wonderful red bud, and then it opens out and you get those lovely flowers you can see there, which suddenly turn pink from being in a red bud. Now we need to move on to talk about yellow magnolias. And yellow magnolias have been the great development over the last 40 years in magnolia terms, because there have always been yellow magnolias. We saw one from China, but that won't cross with anything else. And the basic yellow magnolia is Magnolia acuminata, which grows in the southern American states in quite warm climates, perhaps warmer than ours. And Magnolia acuminata flowers in the summer. It has small yellowish flowers, but they're hidden by the leaves. It's no great spectacle. So what magnolia breeders have been trying to do was to produce a yellow magnolia which flowered as a tree before the leaves came. In other words, to rival the excesses of the Asiatic or Chinese magnolias. And there have been great strides made in the last 40 years. But if we go back to the 1970s, rather, magnolia butterflies appeared here at Caerhays as a gift from the International Magnolia Society and a visit in 1987. It's quite a small growing plant. Its petals, or tepals, as we ought to be calling them, are very pointed, and there are only 4 of them. They're very like acuminata. But as you can see in the other picture, the flowers are appearing before the leaves, but they fade off a bit, and they're soon a rather bland, sort of creamy color, and not really yellow at all. Then came Magnolia Elizabeth, also 1897, also bred in Massachusetts. And you're looking at the largest tree in the UK, which is a bit bigger than that today. Again, it does flower before the leaves have come, but it's not really very yellow. It's creamy and it fades. So those early 1980s attempts at a really good yellow, they weren't bad, but much better was to come. And today we would rate Magnolia Daphne, which is the next slide, as being the best yellow for the yellowness of its flower. And I'm sorry that the picture on your left has it's much yellower than that, as you can see on the right. But the problem with Magnolia Daphne is that in a year where it's wet and the sap is rising, the flowers appear with the leaves. In a dry season, you may well get the flowers out, and they do last for a very long time. But they do need for the period have a dry period for them to perform as they should. Daphne, and indeed one we're going to look at in a minute, were bred by Philippe de Spolberg in Belgium. And the advances made in the size of the flower and in the yellowness over 25 years are quite clear to see. Other breeders have played around with crossing a yellow Magnolia acuminata with Magnolia stellata, and they produced a rather jolly Magnolia Gold Star, which grows a bit bigger than stellata and is only really yellow when it first comes out. And the other great one from Belgium is Magnolia Lois, which again, in a dry season, can flower before before the leaves come. And then we come to a New Zealand creation, because they've been playing the game as well. And this is Magnolia Honey Tulip, which fades off a bit, but it's again really quite a nice yellow, and it's very floriferous at a young age, and the flowers hold on the tree for a good month, so it's good value like that. And then I just wanted to show you, we've seen one with a Tropicana with somewhat vulgar mixed colors, but I mean, the modern breeding is introducing a mixture of colors, like it or not, into the flowers of Magnolia. And I've just got a moment to show you one or two of those. Magnolia Peachy is, there's a cross with Magnolia brooklynensis and yellow Magnolia. And in this way, it is a three-way cross. So you've got a yellowish with a pink stripe. And then we move on to Magnolia Daybreak, which you may find vulgar as well, but is sort of greenish in bud and with yellow outer tepals, and then sort of reddish pink in the center. I mean, really quite a bit different. And if you like a mixture of colors, perhaps that one's for you. The color range of Magnolias is more impressive even than that. And Magnolia brooklynensis is a hybrid between two species, and there are a number of forms of it. And I describe this as a very good example of what happens when you cross yellow and pink. And in this case, it's really black in bud and opens up, fading to a sort of apricot color inside and a blackish red on the outside. Certainly different. And even more different is a Magnolia with blue flowers, or blue buds anyway. I mean, who would have ever believed a few years ago that you could have a Magnolia with blue flowers? But this is again two forms of Magnolia brooklynensis crossed together: Woodsman, which is a blackish one, and Patriot, which is a yellowish one. And they've got a particular form of acuminata in them, and they are completely blue in bud, and then as they open, they become yellowish in the center. But to show someone who's never seen a blue bud, that's really quite something. And then I jump around a bit again and just look at some of the more popular Magnolias, which more of you may well know, but those which are hybrids between two species, and most of which are smaller growing plants for smaller gardens. And the first one is probably well known to anyone who knows Magnolias. This is a Japanese Bred Magnolia, which is a hybrid between Magnolia stellata and Magnolia salicifolia. It doesn't grow terribly big. Its flowers after the frosts have usually gone. It's very reliable, very floriferous. And the other form of Loebneri, Leonard Messel, is much pinker. And the pinkness can vary. If it's blown open by the wind rather than opening on a fine, still, warm day, then you tend to find the flowers aren't nearly as pink as they are when it's been warm. And indeed, the varieties sold do vary a bit. And then we must, of course, mention Magnolia soulangeana with many, many different forms. This is Soulangeana alba superba. These are street trees, they're parkland trees. They were bred originally in France. Nobody quite knows what the breeding was. But Magnolia soulangeana has been incredibly popular and widely grown for 200 years in the UK. It flowers quite late when the leaves come, but it's very beautiful, quite spectacular, usually May flowering in most of the country. Perhaps a bit dull compared to the Chinese, but then I'm biased. And another, hybrid between two species, and another yellow, which flowers with the leaves, but is none the worse for that. And if you actually like a later flowering magnolia, then Yellow Bird may well be for you. And finally, Magnolia wiesneri, which is a hybrid between two species, and this flowers June, July time and is hugely scented. And you see that the outer tepals have pink, and then the center of the flower is white. And this is one of the most scented magnolias you can ever grow, and sort of half a species, if you like, but very well worth growing. And I'm then going to race you through a few of the best hybrids bred by other breeders. And this is Japanese breeder Pseudocobus kubishimikidori. I haven't pronounced that right, but you can have a go if you like. And this has a saucer-shaped white flowers, late in the season, opens out flat, doesn't grow very big, superb thing. And then we go on, we have to go on, sorry, I've got slightly out of sequence there, but never mind. Going on to Black Tulip, which is the next slide. Black Tulip has become, in the last 10 years, the most popular garden centre magnolia. It is quite black. It's very reliable flower, flowers late in the season. It's nowhere near as big a flower as some of the Asiatics and the Lanarths we've looked at, but it's compact, doesn't grow too big. But personally, I think that if you look at the next slide, which shows Magnolia Genie, which is New Zealand bred, then I think this is an even better plant. Our Genie's been in the ground for 20, 25 years and is still only 6 foot high. The flowers are nearly black in bud, and then they open reddish, and you get this beautiful little white fringe on the tepals or the petals as they mature. And that'll stay in flower with us for a good 6 weeks, which Black Tulip won't. So if you have a luxury of a choice, I would go for Genie every time in a smaller garden. And coasting on, Magnolia Felix Jury, like a great cabbage, New Zealand bred, one of the most enormous magnolias flowers of all. Magnolia Betty Jessel, the next one, which is a Campbelli hybrid, and very early flowering, absolutely gorgeous, red on the outside and opening white inside. The last of the tree magnolias to flower is a New Zealander, Magnolia Apollo, and that's way on into May when all the other tree magnolias are finished. So if you live in the north of Yorkshire and you want to grow one tree magnolia, that's the one for you. And we can't not mention Magnolia Star Wars from New Zealand. This is a slightly dirty coloured plant, and I say that reservedly because it actually has the great attribute of flowering 2, if not 3 times a year. Secondary flowering comes in the early autumn, and it shows that it has Magnolia soulangeana in its parentage. Magnolia soulangeanas flower twice as well, although nobody tends to notice because they flower when the leaf is there in August and September. And the flower is also a different color. normally a dark sort of mauve, very different from the spring flowers. And Star Wars is a bit the same, but some years it can drop its leaves and still leave a few flowers showing. In fact, it's a very strange month in the year when Star Wars doesn't have a flower or two, but that's why people like it and grow it. And then just a couple of 2 or 3 very recent, as this is a Belgian introduction, beautiful color, low spreading habit, Antony Zandi, and even better is the next one, New Zealander Burgundy Star, which is a fantastic red and flowering away heavily as a very young plant. And that's the lot of the slides. But now I thought I might just talk you through a few of the magnolias which we've got here to look at. Great. So first of all, I'll show you the cabbage. And here we got Felix Jury, good 10 inches across. Calling it a cabbage is somewhat rude. You see how the gorgeous red in bud and then opening up to this enormous, huge, great plant. And I thought I might just show you as well, just very briefly again, what we mean by the different flower structures. And there you've got Magnolia Campbelli with the very pointed center. And here you've got Magnolia mollicumata with the sort of light bulb effect in the way that it holds the center of its flower together. And I've got another form of mollicumata which maybe shows this even better. And you can see exactly what I mean there by the different shapes of the different species from China. And if I move that one away again, and just show you a Magnolia Sprengeri. Magnolia Sprengeri diva is over, but here is a variety or form of Magnolia Sprengeri, and you can see a very different flower shape and flower structure yet again. So Magnolia Sprengeri, Magnolia mollicumata, and Magnolia Campbelli. And there you can see the differences all in one go. And if you were here, you'd be able to smell them all too. And the scent in this room is really quite gorgeous. And actually, the reason I have not dwelt much on the yellows is because it's far too early in the year to see many yellows. But I have got a couple here. And this one is Magnolia Petit Chicon, which is not a great yellow as yellows go, but it is. It's nice to have a yellow out before we get into April, and it's very unusual. And we've got another plant here, which is American bred Magnolia Sunrise. And if you look at the back of the tepals there, you can see that they were yellow, and the flower bud itself was yellow. And as it opens out, it turns into a pure white. Quite pretty for all of that. But anyway, that's all we can do for yellows at this stage in the year. But I thought I might tease you with another of the multicolors, and you can see the gorgeous combination of yellow and pink. And this one's called Hot Pants, which may or may not be appropriate. There's it's called Hot Lips. There is a Hot Pants as well, which has very different color combination. This one was bred in Belgium by Philippe de Spolberg, and I think it's very pretty, but then I'm probably biased. And I thought we might just look at the Magnolia cylindrica, which we looked at again in a picture, and you can really, I hope, see the gorgeous purple markings on the base of the flowers. And this is the Korean form, which is very different to the Chinese form, which is smaller growing and pure white. if we just turn it round, you can see that, you know, it is a pure white when viewed from that side, but the flowers are held upright. The tree grows in a very upright habit. When you look from below, you actually get that gorgeous effect, which you see here. We looked at a few Loebneri varieties of magnolia, and here's a relatively new introduction from Korea. This is Loebneri Raspberry Fun, and it was bred at the Cholipo Arboretum, and it's as pink as any of the Loebneris are. It's much pinker than Leonard Messel, and it doesn't fade off to white in the same way. And I think it's a startling new introduction. If you see this in any of your local garden centres, grab it, because it's in short supply and a very beautiful thing that can be grown as a very small shrub or small tree in many gardens. And although whites are, there are plenty of them about, this is an American white bred in America called Tina Jurio, bred by Dennis Levida. And I show it merely to show how different breeding has made some of the whites from that white Campbelli we saw slightly earlier. This is, again, quite a small growing bush. After about 30 years, it's no more than 10 feet, with a spread of about 15 feet. But these great sentinel flowers, which have flopped over a bit in this little vase, they're really spectacular. And if you grow it up against an evergreen tree, which is dark green, then you really see the whites of this magnolia sound off, and it's a good long laster and goes on for quite a while. Another interesting and slightly strange little magnolia, we haven't talked about denudata as a species, but here Mr. Pickard in America bred a whole range of Pickard's hybrids. They're dwarf growing and easily grown in a small garden. This is Pickard's Ruby, and all the Pickard's hybrids have this great contrast between the outside of the petals, which is heavily mottled or veined, and the inside, which often is pure white. And a number of these Pickards have this wonderful white rim around the edges of the petals. This one doesn't, but there are others that do. And I thought I'd just finish by showing you one or two of Caerhays' hybrids. And here's Caerhays Surprise in the flesh. The flowers have been out for a little bit, although some of the plants in the garden are still in tight bud, which gives you an indication that if it was in the home counties, it would probably only be coming into flower, you know, in about 3 weeks' time, say the 20th of April. And you see, if you look at the back of the flowers, you see much more of the color of the bud. And this, remember, is a cross between denudata and Liliflora nigra, and really quite a plant, because it again, this will go on flowering for weeks and weeks and last much longer than many magnolias. And I just got two more. And this one is Magnolia Princess Margaret. And you may wonder what Caerhays has got to do with Princess Margaret. And the answer is that there's a Caerhays Surprise. There's a Kew Surprise, which was bred here, but named after one of the curators of Kew some 40 years ago. And then there was to be a Windsor Surprise, which was grown at Caerhays and was to be named Windsor Surprise. But unfortunately, Princess Margaret got to hear of this and collared the keeper of the gardens, Mr. John Bond, and said, "Absolutely ridiculous, Bond. I rather fancy that. We'll name it after me." So Magnolia Princess Margaret, whenever you see that, don't think of Windsor, think of Caerhays, because it was actually bred here. And it's a lovely, it's a big tree and lovely pink in bud, fading a little. And I think under these lights, it's probably looking paler pink than it actually is in the flesh. And finally, our very last introduction at Caerhays, which is nearly over. But this is Caerhays Splendor, which was a three-way cross made by Jamie Parsons, the current head gardener. And it's his pride and joy. And we've got 3 or 4 plants of it from the original seed pod, which flower differently, but this is the best one. It's got the Narth colour in it. It's got Sargentiana robusta in it in the shape of its petals, and it's got Mollicumata in it in the shape of the flower. This is a tail end flower, doesn't do it justice, but Caerhays Splendor I thought was the one we probably ought to finish on. And I tried to keep to an hour, and I believe I've just about done it. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was utterly fascinating and insightful, and makes me want a million magnolia trees in my tiny cottage garden. I'm pleased to see that Jeannie's a small one, so I'll be buying that soon. I know that you think or suggested that Tropicana was vulgar, but I disagree. It reminded me of fruit salad chew sweets. And judging by the positive comments on Facebook, I think there are a lot of admirers. I've never seen any that are yellow in colour at all. So I think that was very inspiring and brilliant talk. We've got a couple of questions. I know that we're beyond 8 o'clock now, but if you wouldn't mind me reading those out. Titch Rivet has said, do you think the tree magnolias in cultivation have reached their ultimate height, and are they even larger as natives where they still exist?
The answer to that is probably no. They're larger in the UK than they would be in the wild. The reason for that is that, you know, on these mountainsides, they're in cloud cover. It's very cold in the winter and there is frost. And they're battling their way through the forest. So the pictures I've seen of China, both from forest expeditions and much more recently, show these magnolias growing singly, but not as enormous forest trees. I think 60 or 80 foot would be the norm. Now, in Cornwall, we may have, you know, our average rainfall here is about 55 inches. Which is dramatically more than the home counties and dramatically more than I think you'll be getting up in Norfolk. And because we don't have the cold winters, the magnolias keep their leaves much further into the autumn than they would in the wild. And therefore you have secondary and tertiary new growth. So I suspect that at 100, 120 feet, some of our tree magnolias are probably a bit bigger than the ones in China. I haven't been to see, but I've seen the photographs.
Lovely. Thank you. Another question. Do magnolias need feeding? Which pH or soil conditions are preferred? And which is the most frost tolerant? That's Chris W.
Right. Well, that's that question. I deliberately, in the interest of time, didn't talk about growing magnolias. But I mean, I think that there are a few very simple rules with magnolias. Yes, they prefer acidic soil. Yes, a pH of 5.5 to 6.5 is ideal, but in neutral soil or slightly alkaline soil, say 7.5%, you can perfectly well grow Magnolia stellata, you can perfectly well grow Magnolia silangiana, and you can perfectly well grow Magnolia loebneri and all its forms. So I don't think, you know, if you actually live on pure chalk, then no magnolia will grow. But if you live somewhere where there is a reasonable amount of topsoil over chalk, then I think you can perfectly well grow stellata and silangiana. When you're growing magnolias, yes, they are greedy, quick-growing plants. Yes, you should always plant them with farmyard manure, compost, or we aren't allowed to say peat anymore, and quite rightly, but they are greedy plants. They are surface-rooted plants, and they should be planted in as much nutrient as you can possibly give them. You don't need to feed them very much once they get going, but you do need to look out for slugs. Slugs are your problem. and not the great big slugs you see in the garden in the daytime. It's the little tiny slugs that live in the ground that come up by night, and just as your magnolia is coming out into leaf, they nibble off the leaves, and then you say, oh my goodness, my magnolia is dead. And actually, when you look closely, you can see that the slugs have nibbled away. So you've either got to prevent them getting up the stem, or you've got to do something around and about and have a slug trap beneath your magnolia. Should you ever prune magnolias, you can prune them, but all you're doing is cutting out next year's flowers. You shouldn't really prune a tree magnolia because you'll distort its shape or its leader and stop it flowering as much. But if you have to, you can do. You should only prune it when it's dormant in the late autumn when the sap has gone down. Never ever prune it at this time of the year because you'll find a huge rush of sap, and if you cut a limb off, it'll bleed like crazy and bring in disease. Most of the tree magnolias sold today are grafted plants, and when you look at the base, you will see clearly where they've been grafted onto a rootstock, and that means they'll flower at a very young age and flower very quickly. But you must not bury that graft in the soil. Whatever the level was of soil in the pot which the plant came in, that is the depth at which it should be planted. If you get earth around the graft, you will often get an infection in the graft and the plant will die. May not die immediately, but it'll die in time. And if you put a rabbit guard around the stem of the plant, you can only leave it there for a couple of years because ants will build their nests up inside the spiral guard, and they'll bring up soil, and again you'll cover the graft in earth and bring in an infection. I mean, after a year or two, there's no worries, providing you don't get a shoot coming out from the rootstock below the graft, in which case that must be cut off at once. Magnolias are fairly easy to grow, but the last part of the question was, are there any more or less resistant to frost? And the answer is really it's about flowering time. And what would flower with us here in Cornwall in March, probably in the home counties and certainly in the north of England, wouldn't flower until well into April. And plants adjust to their environment that they're in. Magnolias know when there's a cold spell coming or when spring is in the air and respond accordingly. Yes, there will always be late frost years and years when your magnolia flowers are frosted, but if you had 1 year in 10 of being frosted, that's probably about par. Any more than that is simply bad luck, or you're living in a frost pocket. That brings me on to possibly the final bit, is that when you're growing magnolias, if you are on a slope, plant them at the top of the hill, because frost and cold comes down the hill and it settles nearest water. So if there's a stream in your garden or a pond, you'll find there's more frost beside that. If you're gardening in the flat, obviously you can't do that, but if you can, take the appropriate precautions. So they're not difficult to grow. If you want to be safe from the frost, then in terms of deciduous magnolias, grow the yellows, grow stellatas, grow soulangianas, grow Caerhays surprise, grow anything that would normally flower, and we would say in the Burncoose catalogue flowers April, May, rather than March, April, and that you're safe enough that way. Or grow one of the evergreens where you're never going to have any trouble with grandiflora when it's frosty, because there ain't no frost in the height of summer. You may get caught in the autumn, but then again, anything would be caught in the autumn. So that's a very brief run around. If you'd like to look on the Burncoose website, you will find endless screeds and lectures and how-tos, and with picture clips and videos and long, rather tedious instructions written by me over the years, which hopefully can help answer that question more fully.
Brilliant. Thank you. I've got one very brief last question, which I'm going to ask because I need to know the answer as well. Helen Gimson has asked, is there a magnolia that works in pots for people that have small gardens?
Certainly there is. Magnolia stellata will grow perfectly well in pots, providing you pot them on from time to time. Many of the Magnolia lobnerides will grow in pots. You'll have to trim and prune them a bit, but yes, you can. Caerhays surprise grows very well in a pot. Magnolia genie grows very well in a pot, but we're talking about starting with a 10-litre pot and maybe going on to a 15 or 20-litre pot after 4 or 5 years. It won't go live in the pot forever, and there is a even more dwarf as a form of Magnolia genie called Mighty Mouse, and that only grows to about 2 feet, but the flowers are equally tiny as well. So I mentioned that slightly in jest. But all the smaller growing magnolias, and I've tried after the initial phase of the trees to concentrate on the smaller ones. They can be grown in pots, but you may have to give them away after 10 years and find a new home for them.
Or buy a bigger house with a bigger garden.
Quite possibly.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, thank you very much for that. That's all the questions. Huge thanks for your time, Charles. We're so grateful. It's absolutely fascinating. Flowers are beautiful, so it's wonderful to see them in the flesh. Before people go, if you've enjoyed Charles's talk and you'd like to be notified of our future guest speaker events, then please make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel or follow us on the Facebook channel if you're watching that way. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and huge thanks again to Charles.
Thank you. Good night.